Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's class in public speaking. And what we're going to do today is to get you, get us pretty much to the point where you can make a speech. Because, of course, that's what we're going to start doing very shortly. So that means that we have to think about what are the sort of the missing things that we might not have talked about enough. Now we've talked a lot about this question of voice, right? Last week was really devoted to this theory of dialogism and how perhaps that can help you to, in a sense, go beyond the sort of limitations of the self, in a sense, and the perhaps the specific, uh, you know, I would say, I want to say limitations again, but the limitations of your ideas, and try to sort of include maybe opposing points of view, and in doing so, you're going to be adopting sort of maybe complementary, intuitive schemes, and stuff's going to happen with your voice. You're going to kind of gain in variation and expressive capability, and that's something to think about, that you might want to adopt at some level or another. And that's, once again, that's part of your critical spirit. I'm not saying you sort of have to just automatically adopt this, but you might want to think about it, and it really might help you to develop ways of talking. Basically, really help you be more expressive and less monotonous in your expression. So, and later we're going to spend more time looking sort of at different patterns of intonation, and that's a little bit technical, and that's sort of sentence by sentence. But before we get involved in that detail, we're going to try to stay focused on the speech itself, and sort of how to go about organizing it and deciding what to talk about. So there's going to be sort of three things that we're going to be talking about today. It's going to be an overview. We've touched on these things before, but I'm going to try to focus on these three aspects. So the first is going to be about this sort of choice of speech. I'm going to sort of remind you what we already said, and perhaps being a little bit precise. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about information, and then about structure. Now, structure is kind of related. All of these things are related, right? They kind of blend into each other. So information, basically, the way you deal with information, you're already going to, when you start thinking about that, of course, you're already going to be thinking about the structure of your speech, because that is sort of the way you break up the information that you give. That is really a question of structure. That's something I really want you to be aware of, is that you should be wary of this information that you give, because it should really be incorporated into the main thrust of your speech. And that's what the thrust of your speech is, sort of where your speech is going, right? And I really want to make sure that you make it effective, and it allows you to sort of go where you want to go with your speech. So once again, choice of topic, information, and structure. So as we've said repeatedly, up to you to decide what you want to talk about. And once again, the almost cruel criterion is the one stated by Henry James, in his Art of Fiction essay, when he says that it just has to be interesting. So that's up to you. And so the choice of speech, really, you should really try to make it one that always start with your audience, right? That's sort of the golden rule. One that you're not going to devote your whole speech to telling your audience what they know. You want to have something sort of new to add, right? And it might be something that they already know, but you might want to look at this thing in a new way, right? There might be sort of a whole new area of thought, or I don't know, it could be even a place, or the sky's the limit. Something that people are completely unfamiliar with, or it might be something familiar with. But if it is something that they're familiar with, you're going to try to, where the direction you want to take your speech is to sort of maybe have them look at this in a new way, because that's going to be sort of the thing that happens, right? Okay, so that's important to know. And this is, I would say that this is best expressed in a proverb, is don't be beating a dead horse. To beat a dead horse is what en français on dit enfoncer les portes ouvertes. I would say that's the real thing to be worried about, is not to sort of be redundant. Meaning, really start by asking yourself the question, what do the people in the audience think and know about this thing I'm talking about? I want to, perhaps in the introduction, no, right, this is sort of a part of your structure, you're going to remind the people what you already sort of agree on of what you assume take, that you want to sort of say, oh, we all agree that such and such a thing is true, and then we're all familiar with such and such a thing, right? That's going to be the beginning of your speech, right? You don't want that to be the end of your speech. Okay, so that's really, I would say, the most important thing. Of course, it's an open. I don't want to be narrow. I would just encourage you to, in a sense, take chances, do stuff that you want to do, try to have a good time. Don't forget, this is try to relax and sort of it would be too bad if you sort of at the end of this class you thought to yourself, oh, I would have liked to talk about such and such a thing, but I didn't dare do it. I won't. You won't be penalized for it. I think everyone will be grateful that you kind of went out on a limb, and the idea is to make this class interesting, and it's really as interesting as the speeches are, and you would be surprised how good these kind of speeches can be. I've had a lot of excellent ones that really just were things that these are topics that I never would have thought of giving, right? That's the idea too. You want to kind of it would be very limited if I was in charge of doing that. So really, sky's the limit. And once again, also keep in mind the range of effect. Do you want to make people cry? Do you want to make them laugh? Are you personally comfortable with doing these kind of things? We'll talk a little bit about personality later, but these are questions you might want to ask yourself. But I would say it's really something you really want to talk about, right? So that'll bring us up to our sort of second thing that we're going to focus on, being information. So information has a lot to do with this sort of dichotomy in public speaking, we could say in art, if you will, and writing often, between instructing and entertaining, right? And sort of diverting and to make people learn stuff, right? So you're very often going to be sort of doing both of these, and it's interesting to know to what extent they can be dissociated. Does it mean that is there going to be just an entertaining part or just an instructive part? I don't know. I think it's nice to think that they don't necessarily need these two aspects, or these two sort of functions, if you will, of your speech. Might not necessarily need to be dissociated, and that's a question you might want to ask yourself. So this question, information is very largely considered to be the part of that is the instructive element of your speech, and the important thing to note is that your speech is the main thrust of your speech. What your speech is about is sort of your ideas, right? Which means if you are going to be presenting information, you are going to be interpreting that information, right? So make sure not to give what we would call non-digested information, right? And once again, we're going to anticipate talking about structure here. What is non-anticipated information? Well, on the most brute level, and this is something it's a list, right? And especially a list that you might have just found, I don't know, on the internet. Let's say you go to Wikipedia and you look something up and you want to talk about something. Hopefully you can appreciate that you are likely not to give a very dynamic speech if you just basically repeat information that you find somewhere, right? And it's almost, it can go as far as being plagiarism, and it's sort of a shame because once again there is a personal development, and there is extent. I'm not saying you need to talk about your emotions or per se, but there's going to be you're going to be making decisions, and you're going to be presenting. Always be aware that you want to be presenting information in a certain way to achieve a certain effect, right? You might want to talk about, let's say you might have a really horrific I would say horrific statistic about how about unemployment, for example, right? So you don't instead of just listing unemployment figures, right? Try to pick one that is likely to achieve that effect. You might want to make one of people laugh about an element of life, or you might really want to really make people think, or you might want to surprise people, or you might want them. So once again, try to make information. Never lose sight of the fact that you are making a speech to create a required effect, right? And the idea is if you give, let's say, a certain For each piece of information, you should be sure to, I would say, react to it, right? Use it, right? In the context of what your speech is about, right? Don't just present sort of brute information, because once again, then it is no longer you interpreting things and presenting your ideas, right? It's going to just be this sort of incarnate. It's going to be lifeless, right? The way you talk about it won't be very interesting. And the test will be your intonation will very likely be monotonous. You're going to be just reading, which you should never do, right? So that's to say is, try to pick and choose information, right? Now, how is this information kind of related to structure? So we're kind of moving into our third part. I'd like to use a sort of a concrete example of this. And so that means that the included video on the speech by Hans Rosling is just an example of one way to organize information. Now, he does it according to time. So I would like you to sort of I would like you to find out for yourself what this is. He's there. Ask yourself, when you look at this speech, right? What is the specific information given? Very often they're going to be dates. There's going to be some statistical data, right? Notice this is someone who has. What's interesting about the speech is this speaker, Hans Rosling, is very interested in sort of presenting data using graphics and sort of in videos. And it's a very clever way not to get sort of bogged down with the sheer amount of information, right? And it sort of, he sort of makes it come to life, right? So, and also it's important to notice that he organizes it. He limits, for example, there's 3 dates. Keep in mind, what are the 3 dates that he talks about, right? And how does that relate? I don't want to tell you. I want you to sort of ask that question. But keep in mind that he chooses 3 dates, right? And the 3 dates pretty much give you the way that he organizes his speech, right? There's a past date, a present date, and a future date. Okay, and those numbers, and to ask yourself, how is that information presented? And that's clever, right? He could have given us 15 dates, right? Okay, but he's chosen, right, 3 dates that enable him to really divide his speech into different parts. Spoiler is that he kind of divides his speech into the first part, the past, the middle part, the present, and the third part, the future. Okay, that's in a sense kind of similar to the way that Obama's speech was organized. We saw that there was this movement of this. I would be ashamed for you to think that this is the only way you can organize a speech, but it is one way to go about doing something, right? So just keep in mind that yes, this speaker has judiciously chosen. This is someone who has at his fingertips a wealth of information, right? He could drown us in information, right? But he has chosen to choose, I would say, sort of meaningful information that is going to be, and that we're going to be able to understand readily. That is, once he also going to enable us to draw comparisons, right? He's going to talk about 1960 and sort of the present day, and he's going to go back from one to the other, right? And that's going to be it. That's sort of another sort of example of dialogue going on. This is the way it was back here, and this is the way it is now, right? And because he only chooses, one date from the past, a date from the present, and a date from the future, he's able to kind of go back and forth, right? Okay, and we know where we are, right? And that's going to enable him to sort of provide what we could call sort of a thrust to the speech. There's a real direction, right? So I think it's a good idea to look sort of looking at that way to organize a speech. It's definitely not at all, and it would be unfortunate if you all organize your speeches that way. But I think it's a good, very kind of significant example to talk about. So maybe we'll look at that. There's one way to organize it. Your speech would be, let's say, on a temporal level. Another way to do it is to play with this idea of dialogism, once again with information, and I would say is to use this is a structure you're very familiar with that is very often taught in the French educational system. When we talk about like une dissertation, we say sort of thèse, antithèse, synthèse, right? That might be an interesting way. And notice when we say thèse, you might want to think of it being you might want to present with this thèse, antithèse, synthèse in dialogistic terms. Now, what do I mean by that? And thèse would be sort of like your idea, right? Okay, and then and that would be your first part, right? You want to be it's sort of a limited idea in a sense, right? Okay, this is sort of your initial idea, right? And then the antithèse would be sort of the opposing point of view, and that would sort of, in a sense, that would be, when we look at our dialogism, would be people that don't agree with you in the audience at some level, right? Okay, and we looked at, notice how Obama integrated that into his speech, right? Notice that was a certain part in the development of speech, and notice he's in that sort of low, when he was talking sort of in hushed tones, right? And he was sort of having these ironic overtones. This was sort of this is something that preceded the build up in his speech, and then when his own voice came in, right, that was sort of when he had sort of gained in, I would say, intensity. Similarly, in the structure of your speech, one way to organize these ideas is that being a second part, and I'm giving 3-part speeches. Doesn't need to be so rigid, but this is sort of, to give an example, and this is sort of a way to adapt this sort of thèse, antithèse, synthèse that you're familiar with. This antithèse could be sort of exploring the opposing point of view, right? And then this final part could be sort of synthèse would be sort of having, once you explore this point of view, is have that sort of bring that into relation with that original point of view that you expressed in the beginning, that thèse, right? And that gives you that synthèse, right? Now that can be a really good approach, because once again, you're going to notice it's going to involve, you're going to kind of wander into, you're going to kind of divert yourself. It has we feel like there's sort of like an arc-like trajectory. You're going to divert, you're not going to be sort of too narrowly focused and sort of on your final statement, but you're going to kind of incorporate, you're going to kind of wander into opposing territory, right? Okay, you're going to really explore the opposing point of view, and once you incorporate that it means you will have sort of you can think of this metaphorically as sort of you will have traveled a greater distance, and you might have sort of picked up a greater number of people on the way and taken them where you want to take them. Now, an example of this would be, for example, I think it's always better with an example. Now, so for this temporal speech, we've already seen examples of the Obama speech. They're done in different ways, but and you will watch the speech by Hans Rosling. An example of this would be, let's say, a speech that the speech I might give, I would like to give, would be on, for example, house music, right? Okay, and I would talk about it in terms of how I first knew house music, right? For me, house music I didn't really know what it was. I knew things that were derived from it. I liked sort of dance music, and I also like new wave music, right, which is kind of related to it. And what was amazing is that I didn't know that it was sort of created in the 80s by black electronic musicians, that they really created a whole new way of making music that has become, that a lot of people aren't aware of who these people are, and now it's probably the most popular form of music in so many ways, and it's amazing that we don't really know how it came into being, right? So my synthèse, my first part, might be just sort of talking about what I knew about it in the beginning. Notice this might lend itself to some slight chronological development, but that's not the main way that it's organized. The first part is sort of the limitations of the sort of first-hand appearance of what we might say. And then my antithèse would be to talk about people who knew about it, but they think of the second part would be to presenting sort of a certain type of opposing point of view, which would be of those who say yes, who are aware of, first of all, they're aware, of course, that these are the first black electronic musicians, but they would present this as something of them sort of naively using electronic instruments, and basically this sort of rehearsing the myth that we have African Americans have this sort of rhythm and spontaneity, and they're sort of naively expressing their emotion, right? Okay, and that would be another one. That's a way of expressing something that I don't agree with. And then I would go on my third plot to say, no, it wasn't at all naive, right? It was a real act of creation that involved a lot of critical thought on sort of the relationship between machines, emotion, what music is doing in society. What this is we're talking about. Chicago in the certain neighborhood. Pretty tough neighborhoods in Chicago. We're also talking about Detroit. We're talking about a place where there's sort of what we would call post-industrial cities. A lot of the people that make this music have a lot of thought about what music is doing in modern society, right? So it involves, it's not at all that the second part is a position, this antithetical position where it's these people are sort of just spontaneous and sort of irreflexive. I would say no, it's actually the opposite, right? So that's a speech I'd like to give. Maybe I'll do it. I don't know, but you can hopefully see that that's how I would like to organize it. And there's a million ways you can organize your speech. So I think it's good instead of I want to keep it open, but I also want to give you specific examples, right? So we've seen you can either do it chronologically, and that there's one way to do it, which we could call, if you will, sort of thèse, antithèse, synthèse, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, right? That's what we would say it. And the example would be, with one example would be how I could talk about, how dance music is misunderstood. I could talk about sort of my own false way that I understood it in the beginning. That would be sort of thèse. Fake, sort of an incomplete, limited thesis. Second part would be sort of this antithetical way of looking at it, right? This sort of way, but at the same time, which is more aware of how this, who created the music, but yet perhaps a little bit lacking generosity about the real creative and reflective capacity of the people who created it, right? That would be the second part. And the third part, synthèse, right, would be to sort of using that sort of opposing point of view, right, and sort of reacting to it, right, and to create that sort of synthesis, right, between that thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So that's just one possibility. I wanted to give you one, possibilities, but that's one way you could do it, right? You might think it works, you might not, but that's something to think about. But the idea is with structure is it's a little bit open, right? You can organize it in a lot of different ways, but it's important that you have parts because we want to get the idea is you want to take your listeners somewhere, right? And if you don't organize your ideas, we might just get the feeling that you're going in circles, right? But if we get the feeling that you go to sort of, so this is sort of a diagram, doesn't really make much sense. You're going from here to here in your first part, that's going to be my thesis, right? Then you're going from here to here in my second part, that'll be the antithesis, right? And the third part, the thesis. If you really divide your speech into parts that you make one build from the other, you're gonna have real. Your speech is gonna have. It's going to take shape. It won't be kind of shapeless. And when it has shape, right, it's something that kind of has more functionality, and it'll be much more dynamic because once again, you're going to be better able to take your listeners somewhere. Okay, so I wish you the best of luck with this. And enjoy watching these videos. We're going to of course talk about the Hans Rosling speech more in detail, as well as maybe we're giving other examples of how you might want to structure speeches, and we might want to try to make that into a workshop. So I will see you next week. Take care.